Hola a todos, bueno, de vuelta acá y muy contentos de cómo está saliendo todo esto. La verdad que nos entusiasma ver lo que están poniendo los chats, nos entusiasma especialmente toda la riqueza de investigaciones que estamos viendo. Y ahora tengo el gran gusto de presentar a un amigo, a un referente en la gerontología, un referente realmente a nivel mundial, cuyos trabajos sobre duelo y vejez son clásicos para la gerontología y que en estos últimos años se ha dedicado particularmente a toda la cuestión LGBT en relación a las personas mayores. Es incalculable la cantidad de libros, de escritos en journals, es decir, estamos hablando de los número uno a nivel mundial y además estamos hablando de una persona que tiene características muy peculiares, estuvo muchas veces en la Argentina, que lo pudimos traer para hablar sobre estas temáticas. Es una persona llana, amable, van a ver que su presentación va a ser sumamente placentera. Y la única dificultad que hemos tenido es que no podía estar en el momento de las preguntas, con lo cual solamente vamos a poder disfrutar de este video que ha sido subtitulado, como decíamos al inicio, por gente de la cátedra. Así que no queda más que mirar este profesor, que es un profesor emérito de la Universidad de San Francisco, tengo que decir esto, es un doctor en psicología, y donde nos va a presentar una investigación sumamente interesante, donde se contabilizaron más de 4.000 personas en Canadá sobre los efectos de la pandemia, focalizando particularmente en realidad en género y población LGBT, pero quizás acá le va a dar una acentuación mayor en esta segunda población. Así que vamos al video y a disfrutar.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for including me and having me a part of your conference. I'm pleased and honored to be here, even, virtually, and to be able to speak about our study on the COVID-19 pandemic and LGBT older Canadians. My address does correctly identify me as from the US. I live in California, but I'm also Canadian, and my Canadian roots run deep and are meaningful to me, and I continue to do work in Canada, including with a team of others who I want to recognize and appreciate, Gloria, Mojgan, Robert, and Paneet. We collaborated on this project. We're part of a national team called the ICANN ACP, the ICANN Advanced Care Planning Study, which is part of the Canadian Frailty Network and supported by the Government of Canada. And so I'm grateful not only to my colleagues, but to this funding. Notwithstanding kind of much media discussion about the COVID-19 pandemic, as really, as we've heard, is the first pandemic of a century, there have been others, including one central to my experience as an older gay man, namely HIV and AIDS. The neglect of this pandemic felt in some ways disrespectful to me of the experiences of so many LGBT people of my age and older, and the countless deaths that have occurred because of HIV/AIDS. It made me wonder how other older LGBT people, and gay men in particular, were hearing this news and experiencing the pandemic. So I believe that the three quotes that are here on the screen, drawn from my scrutiny kind of the field, represent really the range of possible experiences of LGBT persons, and especially gay men. On the left here, Peter Staley writes and remarked on the renewed trauma that may be experienced, saying, "For me and for other long-term survivors of the AIDS crisis I know, COVID-19 is stirring up a lot, to the extent that all of us from those years have some version of PTSD. All of that is flooding back." Richard Berkowitz, whose quote is in the middle here, offers a more neutral, kind of innocuous comment saying, "Wow, lucky me. I actually managed to survive one pandemic, to be here for another." And Hal Rubenstein on the right reflects on the lessons learned from HIV, He said that I do think I've learned from HIV not to be foolish. I do think I've learned that if someone else isn't going to watch out for me, then I'll watch out for myself. Well, each of these quotes represent, I think, a plausible approach to COVID-19 from a community especially hard hit by a previous pandemic. These represent the competing hypotheses in our research study. This study is a national study that had almost 4,400 people, 3,923 of whom are included in these first analyses. Our sample ranged in age from 55 to 99, mean age of 67. All of our participants were Canadian. The data were collected over a 3-month period last year, ending just over a year ago, last October. And people completed a survey of 61 items, taking on average about 13 minutes. The table you see here represents the distribution of people who identified as women and of men amongst the heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual samples. You'll see that the sample, of course, was disproportionately heterosexual and disproportionately women, interestingly. Around 8% were gay, lesbian, and bisexual and embedded transgender persons. We excluded from these analyses those who identified as non-binary or some other gender category, and that was 42 people. The site at which you could find our survey and report is listed at the top here. And if you're interested, I invite you to visit this site, and many of our other publications are also available there. So to start off, some of the results of our data. Here's the headline, is that LGBT older persons observe and adhere to public health orders to a greater degree than do heterosexual older persons. We see that across these 3 domains that are presented here. In particular, mask use and social distancing. In both cases, LGBT people were more likely to wear masks and to social distance than were heterosexual persons of comparable age, and were less likely to socialize at home. So a stronger adherence to the public health orders provided by the Canadian government, both provincial and federal. Excuse me. LGBT persons also reported at least some changes in select experiences as a function of the pandemic. Here we find that LGBT people were more likely to report changes in accessing both medical care and mental health care than were heterosexual people. So probably barriers, but there were changes at least in their opportunities and ability to access care. That was complemented in some way by a greater increase in exercise. So an attention to health through exercise at a time when accessing medical care was changed. There were no differences between our LGBT participants and heterosexuals in their opportunity to access food or income, their family discord, social support, or daily routines. So changes in health access and in exercise. And LGBT people were also more likely to report negative emotions, at least some of the time, the wording of the question, since the pandemic, and more so than comparably aged heterosexuals. In particular, LGBT people reported being sad, at least some of the time, in greater proportion than heterosexuals, anxious, and depressed. These are domains in which we see changes or differences between LGBT people and heterosexual outside of the pandemic. So whether this is a continuation of that or an exacerbation of that is not really clear, but their pandemic experiences included greater negative emotions. No differences were noted in the extent to which LGBT and heterosexual people felt judged, lonely, isolated, or on the more positive emotions, relaxed, happy, or accepted. So to summarize this part of the research, we find that LGBT older people appear more influenced by the pandemic than heterosexual persons. There's stronger adherence to pandemic mitigation measures. There's greater changes in accessing healthcare, a greater likelihood in engaging in exercise, and a greater negative impact on their emotional well-being. We also, as part of the national project, were interested in what's called advanced care planning. Advanced care planning is kind of, as its name suggests, planning for a future when care might be needed. And this includes how important decisions might be made for me, for example, when I'm no longer able to do so myself. So that's the kind of broader label of advanced care planning. When we look more specifically at the dimensions of it, most people liken it to or link it to wills, although that's not the best association. But wills are in some ways a form of advanced care planning, wherein you could indicate how you would want to dispose or distribute your possessions after death. But the kind of nuts and bolts, really, of advanced care planning are seen in these other dimensions, which in Canada and the US refer to the power of attorney for property, for medical care, or an enduring power of attorney. A power of attorney is a legal document that gives one person or more than one person the authority to manage your affairs on your behalf. In Canada, the person you appoint is called an attorney, although that person does not need to be a lawyer. And so a power of attorney is this document then, for example, for property, that you would sign that would give one or more persons authority to manage your financial and legal affairs. If we skip down to the bottom, a power of attorney for medical care gives authority to that person to make choices for your personal and health care when you are not able to. Something that bridges those is called a continuing or enduring power of attorney, which assigns individuals the authority to manage your affairs in perpetuity. That is to say, not for a defined period of time, but perhaps over the course of the remaining years of your life. A document that's related to those that in the US and perhaps elsewhere is called a living will is here called an advance directive, which is a legal document that gives instructions for future healthcare treatment. So an advance directive would say, for example, that I do not want to be resuscitated, or what level of care I want and do not want. In the aggregate, these are all called advanced care planning approaches. And these are some of the specific items about which we asked in our survey. I hope I was able to make that clear. We asked of the extent to which our respondents had completed these kind of advanced care planning documents prior to the pandemic and since the outset of the pandemic. This slide reflects the prior to the pandemic findings. And as you see that there is comparable completion of a will, a power of attorney for property, an enduring power of attorney, and a power of attorney for medical decisions. It's only with advanced directives that LGBT people had completed them in greater proportion than heterosexuals, and LGBT people were more likely to have engaged in care discussions with loved ones than were heterosexuals. This is kind of a critical point. Really, you can't really assign somebody to be your power of attorney without first talking to them or having a discussion with them about what it is you want or don't want. LGBT people were more likely to have engaged in those discussions than were heterosexual people. But it's just on those two dimensions here in which there were differences as a function of sexual orientation and gender identity prior to the pandemic. This next slide looks at since the pandemic, and you see there are far fewer people that have either completed or revised any of these documents. But in all of those cases, LGBT people have done so more frequently. I think this is a critical, interesting point, very consistent across all of the documents. LGBT people were more likely to revise or complete a will, a power of attorney for property, a power of attorney for an enduring power of attorney, an advance directive, or of a power of attorney for medical care. In all cases, LGBT people were more likely to have completed those documents. And LGBT people were more likely to have had care discussions since the pandemic. Almost half of our LGBT sample, said that they had engaged in such a discussion, compared with about 42% of heterosexual people. And those discussions were most likely or more likely with a friend for LGBT people than for heterosexual, twice as frequently for the case of LGBT people. And that's again, a kind of recurrent, important finding, the prominent role of friends in the lives of LGBT people. And when legal issues are involved, it's not so clear the status that friends have, but they have a crucial role in these sort of discussions and in this kind of planning. Amongst those who were married, about a quarter had had discussions with their spouses and with other family members. And not shown here, but a really sad and interesting finding is that very few had had discussions with their physicians, 2%. 2% of the sample had had discussions with their physicians since the pandemic. Prior, it was only just over 4%, higher for LGBT, but and lesser for heterosexual, but interestingly, still very few people. So to summarize these advanced care planning findings, there were few differences really prior to the pandemic in advanced care planning. But LGBT persons were more likely to have discussed, to have had an advance directive and to have had care discussions. Since the pandemic, LGBT people were more likely to have completed or revised all of these advance directives and engaged in care discussions. And they were more likely to have had those discussions with their friends. I think those are the take-home points from this set of findings. What this leads us, I think, Hope and me certainly, to wonder what underlies these sexual orientation differences. It seems to be that LGBT people appear to take and have taken the pandemic more seriously. Well, why would that be the case? Well, there's a school of thought and a mounting number of studies that refer to the pro-social behaviors of LGBT people. And that probably comes from their experiences with stigma and discrimination. So that is to say that owing to the stigma and discrimination that we as LGBT people have experienced over the course of our lives, there is a greater empathy and perhaps a greater concern for the well-being and consideration of others. And research talks about this as pro-social behavior or pro-sociality. And there are now several studies that have found higher pro-sociality amongst LGBT persons and amongst women. So that might be one of the factors at work here. But I think a critical factor is also our shared experience of this previous pandemic, HIV. We, unlike so many of our non-LGBT peers, have lived with and through a pandemic that took many lives, many of our friends over the course of now 40 years. So we have experience with the pandemic as well as with government disinterest and neglect. And as a consequence, we've needed to take control and provide care and know how to seek care. We hear not infrequently a quote, much like I have on this screen, that it feels like we've been here before. That's certainly my experience, and I think the experience of many other LGBT people. Excuse me. So we asked in our survey the extent to which participants had experienced a previous pandemic. And by experience, it's personally or someone close to them has been affected by that. And we provided the following list: the Spanish flu, now 100 years ago, tuberculosis, polio, HIV/AIDS, SARS, and the H1N1 flu, or another one that people could mention. And what we found is that sizable numbers of people reported having lived through a previous pandemic or epidemic. Just under 4% reported the Spanish flu, about reported that they or someone they love had experience with the Spanish flu. Around 5% had reported experience with SARS, just under 6% for tuberculosis, the same for HIV and AIDS, or 8.5% for polio, and almost 10% for the H1N1 flu. It's interesting, but of those who identified HIV/AIDS, 90% were LGBT. So notwithstanding the fact that it is not a disease of sexual or gender minority, at least at this point in history, the majority of our sample who have had experience with HIV or AIDS are LGBT people. Excuse me. We found that about a quarter, 28% of our total sample, responded positively to the question if they or someone close to them had been affected by one or more of these pandemics. And so this group, with the same mean age as before, became the analytic sample for the analyses I'm about to report. And now it includes 88 gay or bisexual men, which we grouped together for these analyses, 65 lesbian or bisexual women, 818 heterosexual women, and 172 heterosexual men. If they reported experiencing or knowing someone who had experienced one of these pandemics, they were asked 5 separate questions about the impact of those previous pandemic experiences on their current experience with COVID-19. So here's the first of those 5, first set of responses to those 5 questions. This question asked, given your previous experiences, do you think less, the same, or more about those experiences given COVID-19? And the data are arrayed here and on each of the subsequent slides by sexual orientation and gender. So first, gay and bisexual men, lesbian and bisexual women, heterosexual women, and heterosexual men. I would draw your attention to the top of these bar graphs. And here we see a pattern, here we see the start of a pattern that is consistent across the remainder, the next 4 of these 5 questions. And that is that gay and bisexual men significantly reported thinking more about the previous pandemic than did lesbian, bisexual women, heterosexual women, or heterosexual men. There's almost 63% of gay and bisexual men said they thought more about their previous experiences, less than half of the other groups. So greater thinking of their previous experiences, and a greater likelihood of feeling like we've been here before. This question asked just those words. Do you feel like you've been here before, given your previous experiences with this other pandemic? Over half of the gay men, gay and bisexual men, said, yes, we feel like we've been here before. The next highest was heterosexual men, almost 31%, and then around 21 to 20% of the other two groups. So both thinking more about the pandemic, feeling like we've been here before, and feeling prepared for what is happening. The question was, do you feel prepared for what is happening now, given your previous pandemic experiences? Excuse me. And a third of the gay and bisexual men reported that they did feel prepared. It was around 20% or less for the other groups. So more gay and bi men, excuse me, felt prepared for what is happening, given their previous pandemic experiences. And they felt like they needed to act or do something. It was 43% of gay and bisexual men said they needed to act or do something, compared with about a quarter of heterosexual women and men, excuse me, sorry, and about 18% of lesbian and bisexual women. The final question is really the question of re-traumatization. Do you feel like you can't handle it again, given your previous experiences? Here, thankfully, very few people responded affirmatively. It was 6% of women, around 6% of heterosexual men, and under 5% for the other groups. So there were no significant differences here, and few people who reported that they felt like they couldn't handle it again. So to summarize those findings, it is gay and bisexual men who are more likely to think about their previous pandemic experiences and more likely to feel like they've been there before. And I think because of that, gay and bisexual men were more likely to report feeling prepared and were more likely to report feeling the need to act. There were very few of them who felt like they couldn't handle it again. So sexual orientation and HIV experience clearly play a significant role. But if we look at other analyses, which I won't go into, but just sort of summarize here, that if we compare those who had experienced any of these previous pandemics by the pandemic, that is to say, did those who experienced HIV, were they different than those who had experienced SARS, than those who experienced H1N1? And the answer is yes, that HIV is the previous pandemic with the strongest effect. Those who are most likely to agree, the tops of those columns that I've just shown you, far higher than any of the other pandemics, with the slight exception of SARS. So comparing across pandemics, HIV was more likely to have that effect. But we know that HIV was disproportionately experienced by LGBT people. But if we just looked at HIV and compared by sexual orientation and gender identity, we find the same pattern. So that is to say, if you're just looking at HIV and comparing within that heterosexual women and men with gay and bi men and lesbian and bi women, it remains gay and bisexual men and an increased likelihood of lesbian and bisexual women to report that they felt like they've been here before, felt prepared, and felt the need to act. So the findings I've just shared are not only representative of gay and bisexual men, they also speak to the broader pattern of this particular pandemic of HIV for this particular group. So a bottom line is that it's a sad familiarity, but LGBT persons, and especially gay and bisexual men, use their HIV experience to prepare and to act during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to summarize and offer some thoughts for implications, it really does appear in surprisingly consistent patterns that LGBT older adults have taken the pandemic more seriously than cisgender heterosexual adults of comparable age. They've taken actions that are both protective of self and respectful of others, though not without some significant physical and emotional costs. I think these findings reinforce that pro-sociality perspective that I referenced earlier. That is a greater likelihood of compassion, of empathy, which I believe are likely the consequences of a lifetime of marginalization and stigmatization, and the legacy of HIV/AIDS. It is that so many of us have endured such loss over the course of the HIV pandemic that we refuse to let that go without having some positive implications on our lives now and on the way in which we relate to others. And I think that these findings underscore the resourcefulness and the resilience of LGBT people. We started with potentially 3 hypotheses of re-traumatization, kind of not much difference, and learning and growing from our previous experiences. I think the data clearly show the latter and perhaps speak to kind of a positive marginality. I wonder if that's a term with which you're familiar. The idea of positive marginality is that that which hasn't killed us makes us stronger. That is to say, of all the stigma, discrimination, abuse that so many LGBT people have taken in their lives, they're using that as a source of energy to do good, to have a positive effect on themselves and others. And I think there's evidence of that in the data that I've just shared with you. I'm most impressed with the consistency of these findings. And so it really speaks to underscoring something important, I think, in the lives of these sexual and gender minorities. I appreciate you taking the time to listen and to including me in this conference. It's been an honor to share these data. I wish I could have done it in person, but I'm happy to have been able to do it with you here. The questions or comments or thoughts, I'm not sure I'm able to participate in that, given that this is being recorded, but please, if there's anything you'd like to share with me, here's my email address. And thank you once again for your time and for the honor of presenting. Thank you.
Bueno, gracias a este grande, y creo que han podido ver la magnitud de esta charla que verdaderamente nos asombra ver cómo se puede hablar en términos personales y al mismo tiempo dar una investigación, mostrar una investigación de esta magnitud y al mismo tiempo generar tantas ideas fuerza que nos dejan como pensando en relación a esta actitud prosocial, a este pensar de otra manera las cosas que un poco mencionaba yo al inicio, ¿no? De poder pensar cómo el estigma no siempre tiene un resultado que se traduce de la misma manera, sino que puede ser un factor de resiliencia. Y en este caso, concretamente, cómo también este telescopaje que hablábamos al inicio, uno puede entender la mirada sobre esta actual pandemia en relación a otras vivencias que se tuvieron. Así que bueno, no me queda menos que agradecer a Brian de Vries. Los que quieran escribirle, no lo duden porque él les va a responder a todos con la misma amabilidad que lo han conocido. Así que ahora sí, lo dejamos un rato y pasamos a investigaciones sobre pandemia que en pocos minutitos, en unos 15 a 20 minutos, que se hicieron en nuestro país. Gracias.